It was a bright Friday afternoon in downtown Los Angeles. The sidewalks were packed with people heading to lunch, tourists snapping pictures, and business professionals in neatly pressed suits rushing from one meeting to the next. In the middle of all that noise and movement, a man named Daniel stepped out of a luxurious five-star restaurant. He had just closed another big deal, and with his $1,000 suit, gold watch, and shiny black sports car parked right out front, Daniel looked like the very definition of success. But there was something else about him too, a certain arrogance. Daniel was the kind of man who believed money defined worth. He measured people not by their character, but by their wallets, their appearance, their titles. And anyone who didn't fit his definition of successful, he looked down on them. As he adjusted his tie and strutted toward his car, his eyes landed on a homeless man sitting just a few feet away near the restaurant's entrance. The man, whose name was Michael, wasn't aggressive. He wasn't shouting, wasn't harassing anyone. He sat quietly on the ground with a worn-out cardboard sign that read, "Hungry. Anything helps. God bless." His face was tired, his clothes ragged, but his voice carried a gentleness when he softly asked passers-by, "Excuse me, sir, do you have any spare change?" "Ma'am, just a little food if you can." Most people ignored him, though a few gave sympathetic glances before walking on. But Daniel stopped right in his tracks. And instead of offering help, he sneered. He looked Michael up and down with disgust, then let out a laugh that turned the heads of people nearby. "Why don't you get a job instead of begging?" Daniel mocked, his voice sharp and loud enough for everyone around to hear. "Pathetic. Sitting here waiting for handouts while the rest of us actually work hard for what we have. No wonder you're on the street." Michael lowered his eyes, his dignity stung but not destroyed. He didn't fire back, didn't curse, didn't even try to defend himself. Instead, he simply whispered, "I'm sorry you feel that way, sir. I pray you never have to go through what I did." The crowd standing nearby shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at Daniel with disappointment, others looked away as if embarrassed for him. But no one said a word. And Daniel? He just smirked, tossed his car keys in the air, and walked off proudly to his sleek sports car, feeling as though he had proven some kind of point. What Daniel didn't realize was that those cruel words, that moment of arrogance, would come back to him in a way he could never have imagined. Because just a few hours later, his perfect day would turn into a nightmare, and the very man he mocked? He would cross paths with him again, in the most unexpected of circumstances. But how could a homeless man possibly play a role in the life of someone like Daniel? And what would happen when fate forced their worlds to collide again? That's what we're about to discover. Just a few hours later, Daniel's day took a turn he never saw coming. The sun had already set, and the streets of Los Angeles buzzed with nightlife. Neon signs lit up diners and bars, while car horns and laughter filled the night air. Daniel was behind the wheel of his expensive sports car, humming along to music, feeling untouchable as always. But suddenly, clunk, a strange noise echoed from under his hood. His car jerked violently before slowing down. The dashboard lit up with warning signals, and within seconds, the powerful engine coughed and died completely. Daniel pulled over to the side of a dimly lit street in a part of the city he didn't recognize. Annoyed, he muttered, "You've got to be kidding me. Not tonight." He grabbed his phone to call roadside assistance, but when he pressed the power button, the screen stayed black. His battery was completely dead. For the first time in years, Daniel felt powerless. He stepped out of his car and looked around. The street was quieter here, a little run down. The kind of place he normally drove past with his windows rolled up. A couple of strangers walked by, but when Daniel tried to wave them down, they avoided eye contact, crossing to the other side of the road. "Hey, excuse me," he called out. "Could you help me out? My car broke down." No one stopped. Some glanced at him, but they kept walking. His expensive suit and watch didn't mean anything here. To them, he was just another man stranded in the wrong place at the wrong time. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. Daniel paced back and forth, frustration growing into panic. For the first time, he realized how vulnerable he felt without his phone, without his car, without anyone willing to help. And then a voice. Soft, familiar. "Are you all right, sir? Do you need some help?" Daniel turned and froze. Standing just a few feet away, holding a small plastic bag and a half-empty water bottle, was Michael, the very same homeless man he had mocked outside the restaurant earlier that day. His clothes were just as worn, his shoes just as thin, but his expression carried something Daniel didn't expect: kindness. For a moment, Daniel couldn't even speak. His pride burned at the thought of being in need, and worse, needing him. But Michael didn't hesitate. "I know a mechanic a couple blocks from here," Michael offered gently. "He works late sometimes. I can show you the way. And here," he pulled out the water bottle, "you look like you could use this. Walking in circles doesn't help much when you're stuck." Daniel stared at him, speechless. Hours earlier, he had humiliated this man in front of strangers, stripped away his dignity with cruel words. Yet here he was, extending a hand without bitterness, without judgment. Daniel reluctantly took the bottle of water. His throat was dry, not just from thirst, but from the lump of shame rising inside him. He didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, and Michael gestured for him to follow. As they walked together under the dim glow of streetlights, Daniel's mind raced. He couldn't understand it. Why would this man, someone he had treated so horribly, even bother to help him? But what Daniel didn't know yet was that Michael's story, his past, his pain, and his resilience, would soon unravel before him. And once he heard it, Daniel's world would never look the same again. But who exactly was Michael before life forced him onto the streets? And what secret was hidden behind those tired eyes and that humble voice? The truth would shake Daniel to his core. The two men walked side by side down the cracked sidewalk. Daniel, usually confident and loud, was strangely quiet. Every step felt heavier than the last. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't in control, he was following someone else's lead. And not just anyone, but the man he had humiliated hours earlier. Michael walked with an easy pace, despite the weight of the plastic bag dangling from his hand. He glanced at Daniel occasionally, as if sensing his discomfort. After a few minutes of silence, Michael spoke. "You don't need to worry. The mechanic I know is honest. He won't take advantage of you." Daniel let out a dry laugh. "I'm not worried about that. I didn't expect to see you again. Especially not like this." Michael smiled faintly, though his eyes carried a sadness that never quite left. Life has a funny way of bringing people back around, doesn't it? They arrived at a small garage tucked between two shuttered stores. The mechanic wasn't there yet, so Michael motioned for Daniel to sit on a bench out front. They sat side by side, the night air cool and still. For a long moment, neither said anything. Then, curiosity broke through Daniel's pride. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said quietly. "You don't have to answer, but how did you end up out here?" "I'm on the street." Michael took a deep breath. His eyes looked far away, as though he were replaying memories that still haunted him. "I wasn't always here," he began. "I used to be a teacher. History and English. Kids loved my class. I tried to make the past come alive, make it something they could feel, not just read about. I had a wife, Sarah. Smartest, kindest woman I ever knew. And we had a little girl, Emily. She was just 6. His voice cracked at her name, but he continued. "For a while life was good. Not perfect, but good. We had a little house, laughter in the evenings, family dinners. But then Sarah got sick. Cancer. And no matter how hard we tried, no matter how many treatments or prayers, she didn't make it." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, guilt pricking him. He had mocked this man without ever knowing the storms he had endured. Michael rubbed his hands together slowly, his gaze still distant. "After she passed, I fell apart. I tried to hold it together for Emily, but grief, it's a heavy thing. I started missing work, lost my job. Bills piled up. I thought I'd get back on my feet, but instead, I sank. And when I lost custody of Emily, that broke me completely. I didn't just lose my wife. I lost my daughter. Everything else followed. Eventually, I had nowhere else to go but the streets." Silence lingered. Daniel's throat tightened. For years, he had looked at men like Michael as lazy, unmotivated failures. But now, sitting beside him, hearing the heartbreak in his voice, Daniel saw something different. He saw a man who had loved deeply, who had lost everything, yet still carried himself with quiet grace. Michael glanced at him, a soft smile tugging at his lips despite the pain in his eyes. "But you know what? I try not to be bitter. Life is too short for that. I figure, if I can still be kind, maybe kindness will find its way back to me someday." Those words hit Daniel harder than he expected. Life is too short for bitterness. For the first time, Daniel didn't see Michael as just a beggar. He saw a human being, a father, a husband, a teacher, a man who had lost more than Daniel could ever imagine, and yet somehow carried more dignity than he himself did. Before Daniel could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the corner. The mechanic had finally arrived, wiping grease from his hands as he approached the garage. And in that moment, Daniel realized, what he chose to do next could change not just his night, but maybe his entire life. Would Daniel walk away after his car was fixed, pretending none of this ever happened? Or would Michael's story begin to stir something inside of him that money never could? The answer would unfold very soon. The mechanic got to work on Daniel's car, sliding under the hood with a flashlight and tools. The sound of clinking metal and the hum of the city filled the silence. Daniel sat on the bench, his hands clasped, his mind racing. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about business, or money, or deals waiting in his email inbox. He was thinking about Michael. Here was a man who had lost his wife, his home, and even his little girl, yet he still carried compassion. He still chose kindness, even for someone who had mocked him. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, guilt burning deeper with every passing second. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You know," he said slowly, "I was wrong earlier. At the restaurant. I shouldn't have spoken to you that way." Michael looked at him calmly, his expression gentle, not bitter. "I've been called worse. It doesn't bother me anymore." But Daniel shook his head. "No, that's not the point. It should bother me. I judged you without knowing a single thing about you. I thought because I had money I was better. But after hearing what you've been through, I realize you're stronger than I'll ever be." Michael didn't reply right away. He just studied Daniel with quiet eyes, then finally gave a faint smile. "We all have our battles, Daniel. Yours might not look like mine, but they're still real. The question is, do our battles make us bitter or better?" Those words landed like a punch to the chest. Daniel leaned back, staring up at the night sky. For years, he had defined himself by his success, his cars, his penthouse, his business deals. But sitting next to Michael, he felt small, empty, because all those things had never filled the void inside him. When the mechanic finally returned with the estimate, Daniel immediately reached for his wallet. "How much do I owe you?" he asked. The man shrugged. $600. Parts and labor." Daniel pulled out his credit card without hesitation. As he handed it over, he turned to Michael. "And I'm paying for whatever you need too. Food, clothes, anything. Just say the word." Michael held up a hand gently, shaking his head. "I appreciate that truly, but I'm not looking for handouts. A meal tonight would mean the world, but money? If I'm going to stand again, I want to do it on my own 2 feet." Daniel stared at him, stunned. Here was a man who had nothing, yet still carried more pride and integrity than most wealthy men he knew. For the first time in his life, Daniel respected someone more than himself. That night, after the car was repaired, Daniel insisted on taking Michael to a nearby diner. They sat together at a small booth, and for the first time in years, Daniel enjoyed a meal that wasn't about impressing clients or sealing deals. It was about connection, listening, understanding. But as they parted ways outside the diner, something inside Daniel wouldn't let go. He shook Michael's hand, pressed his other hand on his shoulder, and said quietly, "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make this right." Michael gave him a tired smile, nodded, and walked off into the night. And as Daniel watched him disappear into the shadows, he knew this wasn't the end. It couldn't be, because he had just learned something money had never taught him. Success without compassion is meaningless. But what exactly would Daniel do to make things right? And could one man's kindness truly transform a hardened heart forever? A week passed, but Daniel couldn't get Michael out of his mind. He went back to his busy office, his towering glass building in the heart of downtown, surrounded by wealth, power, and ambition. Yet none of it felt the same anymore. At meetings, while his colleagues discussed numbers and contracts, Daniel found his thoughts drifting back to that night. The image of Michael quietly sharing his story, refusing pity, holding on to dignity despite having nothing. Every deal, every handshake, every sip of coffee felt hollow compared to that one meal at the diner. Finally, Daniel made a decision. He couldn't just walk away. He wouldn't. On a cool Tuesday morning, Daniel drove across the city to the same corner where he had first seen Michael sitting. The cardboard sign was still there, though now a little more worn from the weather. And there was Michael, sitting cross-legged, softly greeting people with the same quiet kindness as before. Daniel parked his car and walked over. Michael looked up in surprise, recognition flashing across his tired eyes. "Daniel?" he asked, standing up slowly. "What are you doing here?" Daniel smiled faintly. "I told you I was going to make this right." He took a deep breath, then continued. "I can't change what happened to you. I can't bring your wife back or undo the pain you've carried. But what I can do is give you a chance to rebuild. My company, it needs someone like you. Not for your resume, not for your title, but for your character. I want you to work with me. Start simple, as a caretaker, maybe an assistant. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work. And from there, who knows how far you could go." For a moment, Michael just stood there, stunned. His eyes welled with tears, but his voice was steady. "Why me? Out of all the people you could hire, why me?" Daniel's throat tightened. "Because you reminded me of something I forgot. That people aren't defined by what they own or where they sleep at night. They're defined by their strength, their kindness, their willingness to keep going. And Michael, you've got more of that than anyone I've ever met." Michael wiped at his eyes, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't know what to say." "Say yes," Daniel replied softly. After a long pause, Michael nodded. And in that simple nod, a door opened. The second chance. The weeks that followed were nothing short of remarkable. Michael started small at Daniel's company, helping with maintenance, running small errands. But what stood out wasn't the work he did. It was the way he treated people. He remembered every name, greeted everyone warmly, and lifted spirits with his humility. Soon, employees began sharing how Michael inspired them. Some said his story gave them perspective on their own struggles. Others said his kindness reminded them of what really mattered. And Daniel? For the first time in years, he felt proud, not of his wealth, but of his choices. He had given a man a chance, but in truth, it was Michael who was giving him something far greater, the reminder that compassion, not money, was the real measure of success. Standing in his office one evening, Daniel looked down through the glass windows at the city lights below. For the first time in his life, he felt peace. But the story wasn't done yet, because Daniel still had one final lesson to share, one truth that tied everything together. A few months had passed since that night on the dimly lit street, and Daniel was no longer the same man who had walked out of that fancy restaurant with arrogance dripping from his every word. His transformation wasn't sudden, it was gradual, but it was real. The old Daniel measured worth in money, possessions, and status. The new Daniel? He measured it in character, kindness, and the way people treated one another when no one else was watching. One evening, as the office grew quiet and most of the staff had gone home, Daniel stood by the window of his corner office. The city lights sparkled below, but for once, he wasn't admiring the skyline. He was watching Michael outside in the courtyard, laughing and talking with a group of younger employees who had gathered around him. His presence had become like a steady flame in the company, warm, uplifting, inspiring. Daniel smiled softly. He thought back to that day outside the restaurant, the cruel words he had spoken, and the shame that had followed. If only he could go back and erase that moment. But then he realized, without that mistake, he may never have learned the lesson that changed his life. He turned back toward his desk, sat down, and pulled out a notepad. For the first time, he wanted to write down his thoughts, not as a businessman, but as a man who had been humbled. His voice echoed in his head as if narrating his own story. I mocked a man I thought was beneath me, but he turned out to be richer in spirit than I ever was. That night, he didn't just help me fix a broken car. He helped me fix a broken part of myself. I thought I was giving him a second chance, but in truth, he was giving me one. And I'll never forget it. Daniel put down his pen and exhaled, the weight of those words settling deep into his heart. The truth was clear. Success without compassion meant nothing. Wealth without kindness was empty. And the way we treat the people we think have the least often reveals the most about who we are. And so, the story of Daniel and Michael leaves us with a reminder, one we all need to carry with us. Moral of this story: never judge someone by where they are in life, because you don't know what battles they've fought to get there. True success isn't measured by wealth or status, it's measured by compassion, humility, and the way we treat others when they have nothing to give us in return. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. If this story touched your heart, don't just keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that compassion is the greatest form of wealth. Also like and subscribe for more heartwarming and inspiring stories. And remember, we're not just telling stories. We're changing lives, one lesson at a time.